During the 1940s in London, exiled lawyers from occupied European countries were among the main protagonists to coin one of the most known principles of international law. The concept of crimes against humanity states that citizens are under protection of international law, even when they are victimized by their own compatriots. The concept evinces a universalist approach to the law with an emphasis on protecting individuals. Although often perceived as a Nuremberg invention, this concept of crimes against humanity was not a novelty of the tribunal at Nuremberg, I argue, but can be seen as the fulfillment of the so-called Martens Clause of the Hague Peace Conferences of 1899 and its underlying notion of humanity. The Martens Clause dates back to the 19th century humanitarian thinking and international concern, as has been, for example, piracy and slave trade. I argue that the London Charter of 1945 is the fulfillment of the moral approach towards the idea of humanity and a transformation of this notion into a legal tool, so to speak, a concept of humanity. The first legal document using the term was the Charter for the International Military Tribunal to be held at Nuremberg, agreed upon at a conference in London on August 1945. Until today, the emergence of the new term is mythically loaded. US envoy Robert Jackson brought it up at the conference, but giving credit to, quote, an eminent scholar for international law. End of quote. This hinted at Hersch Lauterpacht, you can see him to the right, then a professor at Cambridge who hailed from the defunct Austro-Hungarian Empire, whom Jackson had met only a day earlier. The centralization of legal scholarship around Lauterpacht, however, obscures the different strands woven together into the concept that derived from debates at the United Nations War Crimes Commission active at London, as well as older strands. The UNWCC was a hub of legal thought during the war, an epistemic community of firstly European protagonists forced into exile by German occupation. As will be scrutinized below, the term surfaced in UNWCC meetings in 1944 and was taken up then later by the London Charter. Legal concepts which earlier needed to be discussed at conferences and via correspondence between academics at the London hub had a much quicker breeding phase and were influenced from different legal traditions. I therefore speak of legal flows to highlight the different strands involved in coining the international law. The main protagonists presented in these papers are this Czech delegate Bohuslav Echer, the Belgian member Marcel de Beer, and an Australian chairman, Lord Wright. To be sure, Lauterpacht's role in this epistemic community as a transmitter between the voices from the periphery was decisive for the project to develop new law, but the idea did not originate with him, I argue, or not with him alone. Two questions can be scrutinized through the lens of global history. So first, how was humanity framed as a legal tool? And secondly, what was the impact of all these actors for the final success of the legalist project to civilize warfare, which had been developing haltingly for a century already? Therefore, this talk analyzes meetings and memoranda of key actors to detect these transmission processes. So although the UNWCC emerged in a genuine European setting, so London as the hub of exile communities, which was later broadened to involve extra-European members, the notion of sidelined actors is useful also with view to the emergence of the concept of crimes against humanity. It seems as if legal thought needed the free liberal space of like-minded experts to develop, and in a second step, someone to bring it then to the attention of the powerful for its implementation. Glenda Sluga has argued when observing the contribution of the so-called smaller nations within the framework of international organizations, how they formed an arena of engagement, especially for nations that were not yet sovereign or for minorities that were still sidelined. Organizations as the later UNWCC could thus serve not only as platforms for exchange and debate, but in what Madeleine Herren describes with view to Swiss foreign policy endeavors as a backdoor to power for smaller states. The exile situation offered a truly global movement, a unique opportunity for smaller nations members to voice their concerns and concepts. It is also no coincidence that the common ground these lawyers shared was expressed in the universalism of the Martens Clause and its recurrence on humanity and public conscience. Analogous to Eris Manella, who speaks of a Wilsonian moment after 1919, the setting in London is important. As Julia Eichenberg from Berlin has framed her new book, a book under the title of London Moment, so I prefer to speak of a London hub to avoid confusion. The engagement of exile lawyers within the UNWCC and its forerunners was decisive for the finalizing of a century-long debate. Especially the Czech and Polish exile government representatives, echoed by their Belgian and Dutch counterparts, hoped that the Nazis could be deterred from committing further crimes by establishing fierce legal guidelines. So one result of these debates was the foundation of the United Nations War Crimes Commission. As a result of the forerunner, when the UNWCC began functioning in early 1944, several proposals from renowned lawyers dealing with an allied war crimes policy on legal grounds, jurisdiction of courts, and the possible setting up, as well as the collection of evidence, was already at hand and later presented to the British Foreign Office and the US State Department. So since we have two forerunners, and since they first convened in 1941, the legal circles advocated new ideas of post-war justice within these two forerunners of UNWCC. One is the International Commission for Penal Reconstruction and Development, emanating from the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge, and in short, I call it the Cambridge Commission, and then the London International Assembly, in short, the LIA. Legal scholar Hersch Lauterbach, himself an earlier émigré from Lemberg, Lviv in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was particularly active in fostering the debate and hosted the first meetings. Two topics were at the center of attention. First, the definition of war crimes with view to new crimes, and secondly, the establishment of an international court. For both topics, the notion of public conscience as laid down in the Martens Clause was key. The political context for the first legal think tanks to emerge was the so-called St. James Declaration of January 1942, when 9 European exile governments declared the punishment of war criminals as principal aim of the war effort and demanded the British and US allies to react. The Chinese representative, who attended the meeting as an observer, emphasized that his government wished to include crimes committed by the Japanese army prior to the beginning of the war in Europe in the list of war crimes, namely the annexation of Manchuria in 1931-1932, and several incidents between China and Japan in 1937 and 1938. Although China at that time was still perceived one of the 4 big allies, the British and US viewed these demands as a deadlock. Responding to the Chinese and also the Czech demands regarding the Munich Agreement would have meant a much larger commitment of the allies to war crimes policy than they were ready to provide, but also required a solid legal basis. It thus came in handy that the exile communities had already started the endeavor. In November 1941, they met at a conference in Cambridge on rules and procedures to govern the case of crimes against the international public order, with Arnold McNair as its chairman. This conference aimed to restore a criminal justice system for adoption in the armistice treaties after the conflict in Europe ended, and to arrange for continued collaboration in its legal development after the war. Although this commission saw itself as a body of legal scholars and judges, and therefore chose the form of an academic conference to discuss, its political implication became clear, as well as their affiliation with smaller states. Amongst its members were several justice ministers, for example, Jean Bernay from France, Jaroslav Stransky from Czechoslovakia, and Terje Wood from Norway, but also judges such as Marcel Debert from Belgium and Johannes Martin de Moor from the Netherlands, and well-known university professors now holding high positions in the exile governments, for example, René Cassin from France and Stefan Glaser from Poland. The hosting scholars who were not sent by their governments also took a very active part. For example, British law expert Herr Schlauterpacht and Professor Goodhart, who spoke on behalf of the United States of America's legal theory. The initiative can be seen as expressing voices from the margins, and the inclusion of some delegates of Jewish descent who had fled Germany and Austria is also very noteworthy. The main question discussed at Cambridge were legal obstacles to judging Nazis and the question of whether an international or a national court should call for justice. One of its main achievements was gathering expertise by setting up a questionnaire in April 1942, which was circulated amongst its members and collected information detailing which kinds of crimes had been reported, which groups of victims were affected, and which legal tools were already available to address these kinds of crimes. The results were promising. The majority of states were already able to prosecute all the alleged crimes under their present jurisdiction. Only in the last question, concerning crimes abroad, proved difficult. Given the nature of the racial war of Nazi Germany and its heinous system of slave labor all over Europe, the last category posed the main gap to be filled. The second pioneering body to precede the UNWCC, the London International Assembly, was founded as well in the fall of 1941 on initiative of the British peace movement, the League of Nations Union, LNU, under Lord Robert Cecil of Chelwood. This is an interesting approach from the margins in that a non-governmental organization took the lead in providing a platform for debate. And by the peace movement's appeal to publicity, the impact of public conscience, as demanded by the Martens Clause, is clearly visible. Again, we have a majority from smaller state actors involved, prominent members like Edward Benesch, René Cassin, Jan Masaryk, Johann Martin de Moor, and Robert Cecil, as well as experts like the Czech lawyer Bohuslav Echer. It had the task of adopting a common line on how to deal politically with the Axis occupation policy and crimes committed meanwhile. In contrast to the Cambridge Commission, the number of members had increased and abandoned its Eurocentric position, now involving non-European members as well as the big allies, hinting at the global approach and political implications of this legal endeavor. In this regard, the LIA can be seen as a blueprint for the later UNWCC. Member states were sent in from Belgium, Brazil, China, Czechoslovakia, France, Great Britain, Greece, Netherlands, India, Luxembourg, Norway, Poland, United States, and Yugoslavia, to name just a few. And expertise was also welcome from expelled German and Austrian judges of Jewish descent who had also emigrated to London. The Commission started formally in February 1942, and its main aim was, beside the legal debates, to exert pressure on the British Foreign Office and raise public interest. Its chairman, the Belgian judge Marcel de Beer, you can see him on the slide, framed several key questions for the debate concerning the problem of codification of international criminal law and trial procedures. It was also de Beer who, in December 1943, was sent as an envoy to New York to campaign for the necessity of an international criminal court to punish Axis criminality. Here, the engagement of UNWCC crossed lines with that of the World Jewish Congress, which also lobbied for a world court and the so-called New Justice, to quote the book by Mark Lewis. The LIA debate enlarged academic understanding of what constitutes a war crime, and its findings were printed and widely distributed during the war already. Until 1933, legal theory maintained that war crimes must be dealt with in military courts or in civilian courts applying the laws of war, a line to which the British Foreign Office still adhered during the 1940s. And it could only involve cases about alleged crimes committed within a state's own territory or against its own nationals. But the unprecedented Nazi war of aggression and occupation of half of Europe formed the basis for a new definition. War crimes, as observed by the Belgian judge Marcel de Beer in 1942, could now include offenses against national law and were therefore punishable by national courts, or in a wider sense, war crimes could be seen as offenses against the jus gentium or against international agreements, such as the Hague and Geneva Conventions or unwritten international recognized ethical rules. And for some of these offenses, no sanctions have hitherto been designed. So, as a short overview, so this is the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which was officially founded in London in October 43 and began functioning in early 44. It formed an internationally accepted advising body and was concerned with formulating a minimum standard in dealing with mass atrocities already during the ongoing conflict, and brought together legal scholars from different countries in a transnational debate about justice and about preparing trials. Defined its objectives in three main spheres. So the investigation of facts and evidence regarding war crimes, the enforcement of the law respecting the punishment of war criminals, and legal opinions relating to war crimes and the penal liability of perpetrators. Not surprisingly, given the continuity of its members, the UNWCC, as its predecessors had already done, went beyond its mandate of simply collecting information and pushed for a real war crime policy. The legal committee, led by Bohuslav Echer, spearheaded the debate. So constant tension arose from this roadmap, as both the British Foreign Office and the US State Department had preferred that the UNWCC served mainly as a clearing office to collect evidence. Significantly, a majority of lawyers from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire or Central Middle European states stood out. They, like Lauterpacht, or the father of the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, either stemmed from Lemberg or Prague or had studied in Vienna with Jewish law professor Hans Kelsen. It was less their common origin than the early experience of violence and anti-Semitism, as a high percentage of them were Jews or had experienced violence as political opponents. The engagement is characterized by a strong personal commitment, even a mission to advance the law with all their energy. Raphael Lemkin surely being the most known example, although Lemkin had no known ties with the UNWCC. These legal scholars in exile were deeply marked by their personal experience of persecution and acted in sober attempt to find a valuable solution to bring the criminals to trial. They were also serving as transmitted in the purest sense. Upon reviewing the minutes, it becomes clear that the absence of the Soviet Union from the meetings, as well as the apparent friction between Stalin and the British government on questions of war crimes, was a major concern for the scholars involved. It should not be forgotten that while the war raged on, the Soviet Union was still seen an important ally of the Eastern European states, and sometimes even the more tempting partner when it came to war crimes policy. Czech and Polish delegates were in constant exchange with Soviet scholars and their political representatives. Czech President Beneš, being the most prominent example, never hid the fact that the smaller Eastern European states were in search of justice and support for the war crime issue and willing to accept help from Stalin if Washington and London hesitated. This attitude may have been prompted by the fact that Lauterpacht, as well as scholars like Echer and Egon Schwalb from Prague, could read Russian and were attracted by some new legal theories. In this regard, the preference of semi-peripheral states could have a political impact and strengthen the position of one of the main allies. In Western scholarship, it has often been overlooked that Soviet law scholars were amongst the first to advocate criminal proceedings against the Nazi elite. You can see here Aaron Trainin in the middle of the picture. He's the one with the mustache. Trainin's theoretical work on the prosecution of war criminals involved the early stages of the concept of conspiracy, the credit for which was later attributed to the US prosecution at Nuremberg. His book was translated into English and distributed shortly before the meeting of the foreign ministers at the Moscow conference in October 43 in English, as if Stalin wanted to test his position on his Western counterparts, but there was no reaction. There was even a kind of scholarly dialogue following the Moscow conference of October 43, where the foreign ministers had agreed on a swift and joint punishment of war criminals. The Soviet Union held a first trial in Charkov. Escher was among the scholars who were attentive to the Soviet message emanating from the trial that justice for war crimes was on the top agenda of Soviet policy. In his booklet, Lessons from the Charkov trial, Escher praised the proceedings conducted against 3 German officers and 1 local collaborator as a model for future war crime trials, advocating the practice of judging crimes where they occurred. Escher published for the UNWCC to take up more responsibility and envisioned it as a forerunner to an international criminal organization setting up courts to act as an instrument of international justice. Escher personally felt it unacceptable that those who had broken the law so many times should go unpunished simply because established national codes were insufficient to deal with them. Escher surely relied on Chinese theories when he wrote, "Preparation and launching of the present war must be punished as a crime against peace, and if there are gaps in law, it is our duty to fill them." Another forgotten ally is China, and I've included this slide only today because Barak is here to commentate on it. We should not forget the Chinese lawyer Wang Chonghui. You can see him in the middle between Churchill and Roosevelt. He's the guy smiling with the glasses. So Wang Chonghui is a very important figure, and he headed the UNWCC subcommission in Chongqing from 44 to 45. So there is a certain Chinese interest in reversing legal inequality with regard to China. So it's the law of exterritoriality. And obviously there's an interest to bring to justice the Japanese war crimes in Manchuria. So with this Chinese interest, they are bolstering, however, global approaches voiced at London. In a memorandum submitted to the UNWCC in May 44, Escher followed a twofold argumentation. First, he underlined that it was not a transgression of competencies of the UNWCC when it suggested further handling of the war crimes problem, including broadening the whole concept. And secondly, he advocated the use of the term crimes against humanity. When we look at the papers of US Representative Herbert Pell, we can see that Pell has used the term already in March. But due to the difficult standing of Pell within the UNWCC as well as the US State Department, the initiative of Escher was more successful. There's a lot of pressure going on in this UNWCC, and alliances are formed. So here you can see that Escher has been backed by the Australian representative. You can see him to the left, and the French, and as well by the Chinese. In assessing the historical record of Nazi crimes, Escher stated in his memorandum that the UNWCC had received several accounts on the plain nature of Nazi warfare, especially in Eastern Europe. The proposed new term, crimes against humanity, would, as Escher underlined, cover these offenses and draw a line to the preamble of the Hague Convention. It seems that Escher's initiative focused heavily on the Holocaust crimes, which until then had been dealt with among the bulk of Nazi occupation crimes, an act that minimized their distinctiveness. But he was equally concerned with crimes against political opponents, as he himself was a Socialist Party delegate who had been imprisoned by the Gestapo at Prague in March 1938 before emigrating to England. He was backed strongly by the Australian chairman, Lord Wright, as well as the US Representative Herbert Pell and the Chinese delegate Wunsch King, and finally convinced the other UNWCC members. For him, it was a personal victory when crimes against humanity was laid down in the London Charter on August 45. So my conclusion is this. When assessing the commitment of predecessors to the UNWCC and representatives of smaller allied states towards the cause of international criminal justice, some general conclusions can be drawn. 3 points need to be underlined. First, the commitment of smaller states to frame international criminal law with regard to war crimes was crucial. Motivated by their own traumatic experience of violence and exile, they transformed the hitherto moral and political concept of humanity into a legally useful concept to finally bring perpetrators of mass violence to trial. Some of its members, such as the Czech delegates, stood out from this community of experts. This stance mirrors the political situation of the time. The debate stemmed from a perspective of political powerlessness. Exiled politicians and experts keenly felt the low positions their agendas and authority had to punish war criminals among the British hosts. Lauterbach, in advocating the concept of crimes against humanity, can thus be seen as the powerful voice of the smaller actors, even if he had ascended to real legal power in his new home country. This thesis is bolstered by the fact that Lauterbach, in his own memorandum on punishment of war crimes given to the LIA in 1942, had made no mention of the term. Second point, the London hub during the first half of the 40s created the framework for advancing of a victim-centered advancing the law towards a victim-centered new justice. Thus, the predecessors of the UNWCC served as an epistemic community involving some of the most renowned lawyers of the time, forming a truly transnational network. The surrounding debates about legal terms are therefore vital to understand the impact of its work, as is the influence of Soviet voices on these debates, which became later marginalized in the Cold War. Soviet scholars' influence had been especially appealing to the Central European exile lawyers, and with growing disappointment about the slow pursuit of British and US support, and still before the experience of double standards at Nuremberg, the Soviet approach became an academic inspiration, if not a political alternative for legal scholars like Czech delegate Bohuslav Fejcher. And my last and very final third point, the endeavor was global. With the LIA, the Eurocentric perspective opened up, and East Asian views and legal concerns of the Pacific War were also given weight. The concept of crimes against humanity was the main outcome of these legal debates and later served as a blueprint for the London Charter, as well as enriched international criminal law. The exile lawyers' engagement and their legal flows thus demonstrate the role of marginalized and exiled academic juridical actors in a difficult political context, and shows the impact of smaller state actors in transforming a concept into a legal framework against the backdrop of Nazi imperialism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for your presentation. It really shows how the London moment and the creation of this community is central in the global history of international law. We can see from the Coleman report in the 19th century to the courts of Cambodia and Rwanda, how important these communities were during World War II. So thank you very much, Kirsten, for your presentation and also your input on different national views on the crimes against humanity and how the exile lawyers met in London. Thank you very much. So Barak, so Professor Barak, the floor is yours for your comments. So very much looking forward also hearing from your expertise in East Asian history.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie. I realize that I have my computer set up in a way that you're probably looking at the side of my face because I have a larger screen to my left, so I hope that's not too distracting for most of you. I've enjoyed Kirsten's work now for many years, and I continue to, and I particularly like today's discussion because I think she really helps move us away from a self-congratulatory kind of applauding of European ideals. Everything emanates from the West, and then it moves east. And she really shows us in this, and a short paper in her longer work about the flows. And she puts a lot of concrete examples behind explaining how the concept of crimes against humanity arrived, not just from the domain of, let's say, British lawyers or whatnot, but how it comes at a global juridical moment on the scene. And I think that's very important. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to trace all of the elements as she does. And it's particularly fitting for me, I think, because I was thinking back today as I was reading her paper and then thinking about some of the comments and then reading a few of other pieces as background material that about 28 years ago, when I was first a student in Japan, I had the fortune of, or the chance really, to study with Aoya Kentaro, who sadly passed away last year. And there was just a service for him in Japan. And he was one of the grand kind of scholars of war crimes trials in Japan, really kind of set the field forward. And I remember taking one of his first seminars, which I barely understood most of with my bad Japanese at the time. And I thought to myself, well, this all seems pretty black and white, right? It's war crimes trials. There's good, there's bad. There it is. What's really to learn? And here I am almost 3 decades later, and I think there's still so much to learn. And I think Kirsten's work has really demonstrated that to us today. I'm going to start off with a few points, and then obviously I have a few questions, and then perhaps I might extend the conversation a little bit and tie it into some of the discussion we had yesterday, because it seems to me if we're talking about crimes against humanity, then we might want to push that a bit and then think about the 1948 Declaration of Genocide, and the same year the Declaration of Human Rights. Was there a movement, a progression from one to the other? What does Kirsten think about that? And then I have a few further questions. So a fascinating talk, and really demonstrate this idea that you've been talking about now for several years of legal flows, and of course the importance of also including in the legal flows the Soviet Union. I think the inclusion of the Chinese members is key as well. They often get forgotten in the international discussion of law or the flows. But I also think it's important not to overplay their importance. For me, when we look at the diaries of Wun's King, which came out recently, or the writings of Wang Chonghui, this barely gets a mention. And I'm continually fascinated when looking at their papers, how little they write about crimes against humanity. And what exercises them much more, in part, Kirsten mentions this, is the desire to be included on the global stage as a legal actor. Now, it might be because the Chinese members of the international gatherings are educated in the West, and they speak then, therefore, the same legal languages, and there's no inclusion in a sense necessarily of, let's say, Qing or Republican era Chinese law, but they seem much more exercised from the 1920s, particularly Wang Chonghui, and he mentions this many times, that their main goal is to get rid of is to become a sovereign nation legally, and to get rid of the extraterritoriality laws that kind of govern them in part until 1943. It's also interesting to note their attendance at all these meetings and their desire to be part of, as Kirsten says, this international conversation, and yet there's little preparation for war crimes trials when they're implemented, and they constantly remark on this. Ni Zhengyu, who goes to Tokyo, and others, so they see what's going on. They're paying attention to the conversations about crimes against humanity, but then there's a gap with how is that going to be implemented at court. And I'm wondering perhaps if Kirsten can talk about the idea of crimes against humanity versus then how does one prove it in a court of law? What sort of evidence is necessary? And are there discussions then once the law is executed in trial? Is there a divergence there of opinion concerning evidence, or do people come, does the flow continue and is there more of an accord about how one does that? So for me, it's a fascinating first step to talk about the definition of the crime or crimes against humanity. How does that then dovetail into the goal of justice and the application of this law in the court? Particularly, let's say, in this case, in Nuremberg, and how does that evolve? Was there a discussion of the sort of justice that will be attained for this crime? Or was it really just a focus on, let's get this new crime, excuse me, out there? That's the most important because it allows us to supersede national sovereignty. Also a point that you made. is it merely a discussion about the here and now? Obviously, the heavy influence from exiled Jews and other exiled government leaders. Is it only about the here and now? Is it only about the mass atrocities being committed by the Nazis? Or is there an eye towards the future as well, with what sort of post-war society these groups would like to create? Because they're really, I mean, they're talking about, this is one of the reasons I think you mentioned this also as well, Kirsten, there's a lot of pushback from state representatives who feel that this will, this surmounts too much state sovereignty, and that's one thing that worries them. So is there a sort of a utopian ideal behind this, that people are pushing for a different sort of state-to-state relationship afterwards, or does that not enter into the picture? So that's the first set. Then the second set is, it's a fantastic moment, and then immediately after, or even kind of during the Nuremberg trial and then the other Nuremberg trials, all the Western colonial powers that had been so interested in crimes against humanity seem to kind of throw that to the winds as they reassert their colonial power in Southeast and East Asia. And in some ways, that seems to be a massive hypocrisy. How is that possible, that we just spent 4 years with the London hub, all this discussion of crimes against humanity, and in the reassertion of colonial power, those very crimes or similar crimes are being committed in all of the areas where the European powers are reasserting their authority. And one could include perhaps America on that, as we talked about yesterday briefly with Korea, indiscriminate bombing on North Korea and whatnot. So there seems to be a juridical international moment of accord, and then that kind of leaves, or at least it's only applied to the Axis powers at a certain moment, and it's not incorporated into domestic discussions about one's reassertion of colonial power or in the post-war. Then my next question is then, so do we see, how do you see the shift or the evolution from crimes against humanity into the Declaration against genocide? And you're smiling, so I'm hoping that's the question you would like to answer, or that you've already, in a sense, you're writing about in the book, because in some ways, let me put that on hold for 1 second. Getting back to the crimes against humanity, crimes against humanity also seems to be abused in, let's say, after the trials as well, because it seems to draw strange parallels for Germany and Japan. And it seems to leave off the hook what happens in Austria and Italy. So is the use and application of crimes against humanity, or the misapplication of it, does it blind courts in the post-war to potential applicability in other courts outside of Japan and Germany that weren't followed? So getting back then to the genocide, Lemkin and others who, of course, are there behind the scenes, but not with the UNWCC. Then the eventual Declaration of Human Rights in the same year. Is there a lineage, that kind of a linkage that moves in this legal evolution? In some ways, we applaud, in some areas, crimes against humanity as a new law. Of course, conservatives in Japan would continually say, "Oh, this is an ex post facto law, so it's applied afterwards." Would you like to talk about the use of that law, or the legal maneuvers that were discussed in order to apply that law? And then also the fact that those who seem to cherish crimes against humanity, and I'm thinking strangely here of Lemkin and Lauterpacht, seem to think that the Human Rights Declaration, at least in their writings, under Eleanor Roosevelt and the UN, was kind of it was a warm and fuzzy moment, but it wasn't really legally binding. And so there seems to be this gap that develops, this sincere international juridical moment of men discussing crimes against humanity. And then by the time we get a few years later to Eleanor Roosevelt's push to have the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN, that there's a pushback against that. People don't see it as biting. So was the moment lost? And is that moment lost because of colonial hypocrisy? Is that moment lost because, well, it's only applied to the two Axis nations of Japan and Germany, or something else happening here? So in a sense, what happens to that? And then why does it disappear in a sense for so long? Or does it get sucked into genocide and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and in a sense, get mixed up with Cold War ideology in a way that many other scholars have discussed? So I think that covers, I don't want to go on, I'm looking on my screen, I got 20 people. I think that covers both some of the points and then some perhaps new questions and pushing a bit. And should I leave it at that?
Yeah, thank you, Barak, for your comments.
I mean, I could talk forever, but I obviously need to be quiet. So.
Thank you, Barak, very much for your comments.
Why is this moment lost? As you might all not have heard so much about crimes against humanity, but I suppose everybody of you has heard of the concept of genocide. I would second Sherzod Muminov and also Valentina Polunina, who are both arguing that the Cold War played a decisive role in losing this moment and losing the spirit which was still there in 45. So let's say that the community of nations, which was still a debating or maybe an academic circle, was overruled already by the Nuremberg reality when the Nuremberg court started off, and when frictions became visible between the big allies and especially towards the Soviet Union, and what we call the double standards of justice. The next thing is that my findings seems to underline that Raphael Lemkin and his concept of genocide, if you scrutinize the concepts up to the bones, I get the feeling that they are very, very similar. And at a certain point, Egon Schwelb, the Czech delegate, says this is two rivers flowing in the same bed and then dividing at a certain point. So if we take this citation or this image he reverses here, then we should ask, so why is this river divided and why is it going in two different directions? And I think one point is that Lemkin was absolutely not interested in cooperation. So there, you can't detect any cooperation between him and the UNWCC, although they are very active in American academic circles, and I'm still looking for the smoking gun that they have met somewhere. But if you find it, please let me know. And however, I didn't find it so far. But as the United Nations War Crimes Commission is on radio all the time, especially Marcel Debert is very active in holding speeches on the radio, I would say that this idea of crimes against humanity is in a way, in the limits of the time, a global discussion going on in 44 and 45, and it develops a bit differently. And concerning the Declaration of Genocide and the Declaration of Human Rights, I think we see here clearly also the political interest and also maybe the push of the United States to advocate these principles. However, if we come to let's say a legal point of difference between the two concepts, one point is clearly that genocide needs definition of a group. So you need for the persecution and the evidence in court, you need first a defined group which has been persecuted, which is obviously easy if you think about Holocaust crimes, but which is already less easy if you think about, let's say, the claims Czechoslovakia raised after the Munich Agreement and complained about German violence against Czechs. So this is obviously not a violence which is only going to the whole Czech people, but this is a political violence. And so the concept of, I would argue, with I see many lawyers in this room, so I hope nobody will object too much. So my historical understanding is that crimes against humanity is the umbrella term which could cover a much wider variety of offenses, while genocide is more clear-cut and therefore more usable in court as well. So this is the other side of the medal. The next point is crimes against humanity has always, for several reasons, has been bound to conventional war crimes. You might have heard this story of the Nuremberg court when the tribunal was set up. There was a translation issue which linked crimes against humanity to conventional war crimes because of a missing comma. So in later courts after 45, crimes against humanity always got prosecuted in conjunction with conventional war crimes, and therefore it is sidelined a lot. This has only been changed by the Control Law Council Law number 10, which is, however, only valuable or only valid in Germany in the occupation zones. So, and this is to answer Barak's question, why Austria and Italy are basically not affected, because Control Council Law number 10 is not in force in Austria, neither in Italy. And that brings me to the next point. I have complained about the Cold War and the sidelining of the Soviet Union as an actor, but I would also like to raise the issue of the big allies choosing very clearly to prosecute only Germany as the successor state of Nazi violence, and letting Italy and Austria very elegantly off the hook. And we can see the results of this non-prosecution of large groups and elites, albeit the same degree of perpetrators in the societies, till today, when we check memory politics in both countries, would be my quite provocative thesis here. So, for example, Eisenhower, with regard to Italy, he says, oh, Italy has only been, I quote, the little boy who has been abducted by his elder brother, Germany, and we should lead him back into the society of nations and just separate him from his elder brother, and so the small boy will become a good boy again. So this is Eisenhower talking about Italy in the autumn of 43. With regard to Austria, you might all know that the Moscow Declaration has this famous phrase inside which says at a certain point, we are judging Axis violence in the Axis states. And then it goes on and says, but Austria not, because Austria has been the first victim of Hitler. And if you've ever had occasion to see photographs of cheering crowds in March 38 welcoming Adolf Hitler to the Hofburg and Heldenplatz in Vienna, you will surely question the issue of being the first victim in Austria.
Christine, can I
bitte.
Just on that one note right there, does that have anything to do with the collection of evidence that that those groups were so focused on crimes against humanity within German Nazi spheres that they gave no thought to the collection of evidence, and therefore it would be difficult to have proven that afterwards? Or was it a politically motivated policy from the start, do you think?
I think it was a politically motivated step from the start. And regarding the question of evidence, I think the whole situation in 45 was quite chaotic. So getting evidence was the same in all over Europe. So you were trying, for example, in liberated camps, to gather evidence from survivors, from slave laborers before being repatriated back to the Ukraine or to Poland. However, I think nobody made systematic use of it, and normally courts were trying to implement war crimes legislation because it seemed a bit more clear-cut and a bit easier. And the next thing is, after the Nuremberg Court, the Nuremberg Principles, which include crimes against humanity, have first to be ratified by national law. And I've checked that only for Austria because I'm living there now, and I've found out that Austria has ratified the Nuremberg Principles only in 1970. So this is quite late for any war crime tribunals after 45. So I think if we go down the ladder and just check who implemented which legislation at what time, then we get also an answer why Lemkin was more successful with his concept on genocide, and crimes against humanity linges a bit around as a sub concept or something only lawyers know about. But it had been incepted as being the broader term, and including also, let's say, communists put into concentration camps, and political opponents, Sinti and Roma. To overcome the narrow focus on Holocaust crimes. But I would also like to stress that if we look at Nuremberg, and if we look at the 12 subsequent trials at Nuremberg, the Holocaust is not at the focus. So this focus on Holocaust crimes is more an issue of the late 50s and early 60s. So you all know the Eichmann trial, or you know the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. So this is maybe a lesson learned, or a learning system, and it takes some time until these issues come to the fore. I think I've missed several points. I would maybe like to come back to your comment on China. I find it really interesting, and I'm relying here obviously also on finding of our research group, and especially of Anja Bieler, who's about to finish her wonderful PhD on that topic. So watch out for her book then as well. So the desire to be included on a global stage is a very clear aim of the Chinese protagonists, especially those present in London. It is an interesting question whether the education in Western universities plays a role, that they are so engaged with international law, or is it just as they are on the spot and see an opportunity arise for political weight, which would bolster my theory of smaller states using conferences as arenas of engagement. So you are the China expert, Barak, so you know better than I do. And I subscribe to your point that the state sovereignty issue is a large point. Obviously, crimes against humanity would, if applied correctly, also threaten the big allies of whatever crime against minorities. If we start with opening the racial question, or also the colonial question, I think all the big allies were guilty of these kinds of crimes. So it is not super surprising that nobody was really interested of pushing that more forward. So Egon Schwelb tried, and he became a very famous professor at Yale. But Lemkin was the more successful with his genocide term. But on the other way, you could also say, okay, then this declaration of genocide was made, and then it was left there on nice paper for quite some decades.
Thank you, Kirsten.
I couldn't yet read all the...
there were many questions and remarks. If I can just add a point on the racial question and the crimes against humanity, we should look at what is happening in 1926. In 1926, the Convention Against Slavery is signed in Geneva. Interestingly, all the powers which are signing this convention, so many of them are sitting in London, and no one, and if I'm right, no one reflect on this convention of against slavery. And this is just showing something very important. It's that there is a dichotomy in international and the comprehension of international law. So first of all, you have the international law, which is applicable to European powers, and you have the second one, which is applicable to all the powers, which is still very problematic. And this problematic is this point is really problematic, because in the Convention of Against Slavery, we have in the Article 9, which you have the fact that European powers can, if they want, not apply the Convention Against Slavery, so in their own colonies or in their powers and their sovereignties. And if we look at also powers, so like French actor like René Cassin, he is also very involved in the French colonies, and he is a French representative in exile in London, and it's a very important point. So I would like to take a first round of question. I think that I had already one question raised by so Andrew Levidis. Yeah, I think you have one question, Andrew.
One question, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it all right to go?
Yeah, you can go. Yeah.
Yes, it go. Okay, so thanks so much, Kirsten, for this, and Barak for for this really interesting talk. So I want to sort of focus less on the legal dimensions, but more on the kind of distinctions of place, like a more historical sort of understanding. So I mean, when we start to think about this sort of talk that you've given today, the first place is we're talking about London. And London's like the center of this global empire. It's a wartime capital on the front lines of this European war. And it's also a base for exiles of fallen empire. And it made me think about what Barak said. He said, Professor Kushner said about a global juridical moment. But it was a global moment, but it was a global moment that was sort of structured by imperial and racial hierarchies. And so it sort of makes me think about the sort of lawyers who you're looking at, Professor von Lingen. You know, the French, the Dutch, the Belgium, Austrian, these are people who come from former empires. And on the other hand, there are other lawyers who come from places like from Czechoslovakia, Poland, China, who are the victims of colonialism. So what I want to ask is, how did these imperial and colonial dimensions structure the preoccupations and understanding of international lawyers? How did it shape their arguments, the divisions among them? Because it seems to me that instead of looking at how the Cold War sort of broke this global moment, it seems to me the questions of empire and race were at the very heart of sort of fracturing the global moment from its very beginning. It was a global moment, but it also seems to be an imperial moment. So I was just wondering what you thought.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this wonderful question. I like your notion of imperial moment. But when scrutinizing the transcripts we have from all the meeting, I must clearly underline that the most active are the small nations. So the not empire nations. So it's the Belgian guy, the Dutch guy, the Polish guy, and the Czechs. So this is very, very remarkable. And the Yugoslav. So I really regret Sabina is not here at the moment. The loss of empire is already 30 years ago by the Second World War. So for the what I call emigre lawyers, so from especially Lemberg, Lviv, Prague and Vienna were the universities where they studied law. However, this world had gone into ruins already in 1918. And I think they are not so much thinking in empire lines anymore, but more in in lines of academic engagement and also in lines of the League of Nations. So what I'm inquiring at the moment is a chapter on the earlier strands of their cooperation, as I found out that several of them were active in the Minority Commission in Geneva during the interwar period. And this is obviously remarkable. So maybe we can argue that these protagonists, which we perceive as a kind of second line or technical elite, has learned to cooperate in commissions, in committees, in conferences, and wishes to bring that forward also in the Second World War, and just continues what they used, how they used together, and to voice their concerns, because they know that on a normal day they won't have any access to the political stage, so they won't be invited to any political meeting of the big allies. And in fact, the big delusion is the moment of the London conference, which, as you see, is a conference which is held in London. So everybody's present, and the UNWCC lawyers are not allowed to enter the building. So they are really in the antechambre of this conference, always lingering in the hall. We have this in Escher's diary, where he thinks he can get a glimpse of Lauterbach or of Robert Jackson, and maybe talk to them briefly, at least 2 lines, and he never gets them, and he's so disappointed. It says, I have so much to say, and again, we are not invited. And then the next hope is that the European exile countries are called to the bar in Nuremberg, as was the case in Tokyo, where we have 11 countries sitting in judgment on the Japanese violence. But this was not the case. This was not adopted for Nuremberg. So France was invited, but for example, not Belgium, not the Netherlands, not Poland, not Czechoslovakia. And this was a big blow to their expectations. They were really disappointed about the Allies' policy.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think Sherzod has a question as well.
Yeah, Sherzod has also a question. So Sherzod, please, what is your question?
Thanks. Very quick comment and then a question. Thanks, Kirsten, first of all, Professor von Lingen, for a very stimulating talk. I learned so much. I took maybe 15 pages of notes. And this is something I've thought about in a different context, but you've made me think about the role of the Soviet Union and the role of the Cold War, hence my intervention in the chat. Because you call Soviet Union a tempting partner, and this is wonderful. This is the best phrase for me, because Soviet Union was tempting partner, as you know, not only within Europe, but also in the Tokyo trial, maybe not so tempting for the Western allies, but Soviet Union, in the same way as you mentioned, it did with the London conference and the community of these lawyers, was also the one which often came up with these quite radical or quite critical interventions during the Tokyo trial, you know, for example, calling for the prosecution of the emperor, etc., etc. So in a way, I see this as a competition, as the start of the Cold War already, as the World War is still going on. You know, in a way, Soviet Union is why Soviet Union is doing this. I want also to tie in this to Barak's comment about China. The Chinese lawyers, apologies, my children are in the background. The Chinese trying to kind of establish China as a sovereign legal nation. And again, probably this will sound a little bit provocative, but I would claim that Soviet Union is trying to establish itself. We kind of retrospectively think that Soviet Union has always been this juggernaut, but it was not. In the 30s, it was just a pariah, you know? And it was because of the Second World War and because of its huge sacrifice, did it earn a place, a kind of a grudging admission of the West. So Soviet Union, in a way, is also trying to establish itself legally. It is also, in a very Stalinist way, which has been a tradition, and Stalin never made a secret of this, is trying to kind of kind of destabilize the West, try to create certain initiatives which would destabilize the alliances, or maybe kind of create issues between allies, etc., etc. So to move to my question finally, you mentioned, we talk about international law, we talk about international order, international community, etc. However, if the Cold War was already starting in the 19th, during World War II, if the competition, be it for sovereignty, be it for legitimacy, be it for the final order or the final say in what the post-war order will look like, is already starting during World War II. So shall we call it international law? How international is it by the end of World War II? So, or shall we call it, borrowing from Cold War scholars, Cold War historians, they like to call, or Odan Westad likes the phrase Cold War international system. Shall we not use Cold War international law then, in a way? Cold War international law or Cold War international justice for the crimes committed in World War II. Apologies for this long question and comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shazo. I think you are perfectly right, but I'm not the one, obviously, to change international terms. But we can go on for hours, and I think Valentina could also intervene now, as she's the specialist on Aaron Trainin, obviously. And I think there are several points to be made about Trainin, for example, who is a very eminent lawyer. So Valentina, if you want to intervene personally.
Yeah, just a couple of remarks to what Sherzod said. Yeah, I agree totally that the Soviet Union wanted to establish itself, just like China, in addition to what Barak said, establish itself legally. Because Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, as Sherzod said, and Soviet Union wanted to show that they are just like as legal or just as legitimate superpower, just like the United States, for example. The Soviet Union wasn't a superpower before the end of the Second World War, but not only that, but there was also a competition, not just like on a political level. There was a competition between the Soviet Union and the so-called capitalist world or Western world, in the field of law, and by showing or like doing. Soviet Union conducted more war crimes trials than, as Kerstin, for example, said, Western powers, Western allies who were quite lenient towards other nations rather than Germany. And they wanted to show, first of all, that they want to prosecute war criminals, but secondly, that their concepts, their Soviet law was better than, so to say, Western law. This is one point. And maybe also add to what Barak said about the application of the concept of crimes against humanity later, why it maybe from the Soviet perspective, I can say that they also didn't apply it after the war, and already quite late in the early 40s when it had been already used in international setting. They still relied on their own legislation, but they actually, unlike the Western allies, they hoped that the term or the concept of crimes against humanity would be more widely applied in the future. That's why all this preparation.
I just wanted to make the point that Aaron Trainin has been overlooked scholarly, and it is also read very often that Trainin has been associated with Wyszynski in the ill-famed trials in the 30s in Moscow. So he's a bit sidelined as being the bad guy. But on the other hand, if we scrutinize the concepts, and this is what I learned from your wonderful PhD, and also there is a book forthcoming. So if the chat is now full with forthcoming books, so please also mention Valentina's book on the Soviets and their war crimes policy. And I think Trainin is a valid legal voice in these 40s, and it is heard in London. That was my point.
Yeah, definitely. He was hurt very much, and we all know, yeah, that like several, like Jackson, for example, praised him, and even like said things like, "Oh, after hearing Trainin, I think that this and that views, like Americans and Soviet views on certain things, legal things, are not that different." Like, can you imagine that an American lawyer said something like that after talking to Trainin, or like having a common session in London? Yes, Trainin suffered from his association with Shinsky, but I think first of all he suffered because, or his legal ideas, because he was from the Soviet Union, basically, and because Soviet trials had very little in common with what was understood as a fair trial in the West. I think this attitude was just applied to Soviet legal thought and Soviet concepts, to the theory of law in the Soviet, that was developed in the Soviet Union by scholars of international law. Just, I think also, as it has already been mentioned, the Cold War had an impact on how Trainin's ideas were seen later. After 1945, he was kind of forgotten, even though he played a major role in London. And his book was widely discussed and translated. Yeah, and Maxwell 5 said it was God sent the Trainin's book.
Okay. Kirsten or Barak, do you want to reflect on Valentina's Polonina intervention?
I think she's finished or very clearly laid out the argumentation, and obviously
the challenge relative.
and I'm trying to. It is a bit a challenge. Sorry, I'm not very good in multitasking, to read the chat at the same time and respond and be focused on
No
your
problem.
question. So, and I saw that there were several questions in the chat on legal issues. I would like to flag again that I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't really answer all these questions on implementation and legal authority. And obviously, maybe I should mention at least that point. Crimes against humanity has seen a renaissance after the Yugoslavian wars in the mid-90s, and is now applied in court much more often. Maybe it will at some point come to the value the exile lawyers had attributed to it in the 40s already. However, today's application of crimes against humanity, be it in the Rwanda trials or in the Yugoslavia trials, is a totally different set of questions. And I apologize for not being able to engage with that on a scholarly level. But I can only lead you back to my story of the 40s and of London as a hub, and also of my theory that these smaller states really used the arena they were given to push and to unite. I think there's 2 points. It's not only the thing of place, so we are all in London, so we should do something about it, but it's also a strategy behind. So we unite, and then we have finally the force of at least one big ally. So this is a bit the strategy. And obviously, lawyers who had ties to privately to the press or to the politics in Great Britain took a bit the lead of the story. And here's to name Marcel de Beer, the Belgian judge, who's married to a British lady and her father was a lord in the House of Lords. So Marcel de Beer has a possibility to put topics on the agenda in the House of Lords. So, and you find that only if you finally go in the private papers of these people and finally find this missing link and say, oh, that's why. And he has very good friends at the BBC, so he's sometimes called for an interview and can advocate all these theories and his ideas that we need a new definition of justice and war crimes should be widened, the principle, and not so narrowly applied only on soldiers and combatants. And so this is very interesting. This is a bit the history of my story. I've put my recent English article, who came out with modern intellectual history. If somebody of you is interested in reading what I've just given as a lecture tonight in English, so this is the point. And I'm very sorry, you have to still wait for the book, because translating books is a longer endeavor. Barak, maybe you want some final remarks.
No, I mean, no, it's a very, I mean, I still perplexed by the inability of Western nations to turn at least the discussion of crimes against humanity toward themselves during the wars of decolonization. I mean, one would think, you know, certainly as Anne-Sophie has somewhat kind of done work on and whatnot, France is a key. But I mean, Belgium, I mean, it's interesting that we have the Belgian representative. Of course, they're completely incapable of dealing or even discussing nationally at the level until very recently the issue of what they did in the Congo, and not just in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century. And it kind of just goes back to my point that in some ways the conversation about crimes against humanity gets hijacked as a Nazi wartime Japan only momentary law.
Yeah.
And that doesn't get applied afterwards. And I mean, part of it, I think, goes back to your point of the Cold War, but I think there are other issues at stake, and that might be something to kind of look into, or we'll be discussing it, I'm sure, as we move forward as well. But I find that to be a fascinating, all this effort that you're talking about, and the achievements of that moment, and then why that doesn't get turned inward in any kind of reflective legal manner for at least 50 years until the Rome Statute. But again, it's always applied somewhere else. It's always it's Yugoslavia, it's Africa, it's always over there, and it's never, again, in the West where, in a sense, it kind of originates. I find that to be an interesting and very glaring absence, and would like to think about that more. Yeah,
sorry for asking too many questions. Very quickly, if I have time. My question is to Kirsten about your community idea. I think it's really interesting, and epistemic community. So there is this understanding that you have a group of lawyers who have a kind of, you can even call it a sense of mission, be it professional or personal, to establish certain guidelines for the international community to follow. On the other hand, you also mentioned this episode when they are so against cooperating with UNWCC, if I got it correctly. My own knowledge of this is very limited. It's limited to one book by Philip Sands, East-West Street, which has been criticized, obviously, and I'm not a legal scholar. I really don't know what was what, but the sense I got from that book is also that there was this, that Lemkin and Lauterbach wouldn't even speak to each other. You know, they were kind of rivals. So this also brings, I think, ties into the concept that Barak has written about, competitive justice, in a way. So my question is quite simple. If there is a community and if there is a sense of common mission, how does that relate to, how do you explain all this competition? Because my sense of all of this, again, I mentioned the Soviet Union, it's competition already for the order, for the version of history, for the version of justice, etc. Is it still possible to talk about the community, or is it just simply a professional legal community in a very narrow sense?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I think I can't dare to really finally answer that, because I think in all the discussions I've read and the transcripts I've unfolded, you can always see a two-level discussion going on. One, you have the individual, and I can truly tell that most of them are on a mission. They are really really eager to get this concept forward and find a tool which will be able then, after the military defeat, to bring the Nazi perpetrators to trial. So most of them have experience with Nazi brutality firsthand in Gestapo prisons and similar camps. And the exile lawyers are really very very clear about their British and also American hosts not to have experienced any kind of Nazi occupation, and thus not being really able to understand the deep dimension of persecution and state violence, and thus in the eyes of the lawyers still clinging to this concept of state sovereignty, although they have no clue what's going on in the eastern bloodlands of Europe and what has happened there terribly. And if you look, for example, Barak's point on Belgium, so Marcel de Beer is a one-man show in a way. So he's very interested in forwarding this and getting later maybe a good position in Belgium by his merits he has done in London. However, there is also a Belgian government, and my colleague Anne-Marie Weisers has just published a book on that, and they hate him obviously because they say, oh, the bear again, and he has made this in this statement. So this is not a Belgian official statement. I think this is another dimension of the story which we need to bear in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Barak, do you have any other comments? Okay, great. So I think it's really, so thank you. So I'm going to conclude here because of the time. So thank you very much, Professor Kerstin van Lingen and Professor Barak Kushner for your presentations. And it really shows the importance of interpersonal connections and the key concept of communities. And during the first session, we also discussed the importance of Washington, other places like Washington, where all the lawyers were meeting and were facing the programs at home, the racial discrimination of the Black Afro community, for example. So you had really an influence of a huge influence of places where people lived, where were there. And we can see also when we read the diaries of the people in Chongqing during World War II. So these places had been bombed already by 1937. These people suffered together. So you had interpersonal and also emotional links between people. And I think that these kind of communities are truly important in the definition of the key concept of legal categories. And we had a very important discussion, and I think that maybe this kind of discussion should be also, so when we look at as an opening, when we look, for example, as at the Tokyo trial, and no one has ever seen this Tokyo trial from a racist point of view. And because if we look at the American conception of the Nuremberg trial, so they excluded really, so they created this concept of crimes against humanity, and they excluded it. They really excluded the fact that that the crimes against humanity could be used at home. But also this question is also when we look at the racial relations between the Japanese and the American, and here I will reflect on the conversation I had with Andrew on this subject. We discussed a lot about this question. How did the American perceive the Japanese at that time? And did it have any influence on the Tokyo trial? And this question should be very important when we look at the Tokyo trial.